Hello, I am Dr. Leah Leach, the headmistress of the Uhura Training Academy. That is something that I've completely made up. I am also the founder of Gal's Guide. That is totally a real thing. So this is the first class of the online version of the Uhura Training Academy. This class is the life and legacy of Nichelle Nichols, and we are broadcasting from the Gal's Guide Library in Noblesville, Indiana. So a few housekeeping notes, as this is our first class. So classes are noon on Zoom. They are Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Best 4 days of the week, I'm guessing, because Uhura's Training Academy. It should be the same Zoom link for each class, unless we get Zoom bombed, and then I'll have to change the link and I will email it out to everybody just in case that happens. Hopefully it does not. But for right now, it's the same link. We're also recording these classes. I'm recording it just with my screen, so hold those glorious questions until the end. That way your privacy is totally respected. At the end, I'm going to switch so we can see all of our screens and talk about it and all that kind of good stuff, and I won't include that on the video portion. So yes, the YouTube videos are going to be posted like a week later. So it's Wednesday, so this will be posted next Wednesday on the site, which is great because if you want to share it with somebody who couldn't come, or later down the line, like, oh, that was a great class. I learned so much. What was that one thing? So it'll be on the YouTube channel on Gal's Guide, but next week. So yes. So for our certified graduates, I know we have two of them, Carol and Mona. I am designing the custom sticker that will have Uhura's Training Academy on it. I'm going to design it this week, and then I'm going to send them to the printer and then have that packet delivered to you. So those awesomenesses are on their way. So yay. All right, let's get started. All right, I'm going to present the life and legacy of Nichelle Nichols. It is a really fun, in-depth way to look at her life and her legacy and actually how she changed the face of NASA, believe it or not. So Nichelle Nichols is most famously known as Uhura from Star Trek. Her lovely likeness by Bonnie Fillenworth did this art, by the way. She was Uhura on the original Star Trek television series, but this gal actually almost quit the show to follow her dream. If she would have quit, NASA and television would have never been the same. So quite simply put, Nichelle Nichols inspired a nation to dream bigger and dream in color. So she was born in Chicago in Robbins, Illinois in 1932. Her birth name was actually Grace Nichols. She was not yet Nichelle, but I'm going to keep calling her Nichelle because that makes it a little bit easier. But she was brought up as in an independent and successful family. Her grandfather was a white Southerner who went against the family's wishes and married a Black woman for love. The couple settled in an all-Black governed and integrated community of Robbins, Illinois. And in the 1900s, they started having a family. So Nichelle's father, Sam Nichols, went to Howard University and he became a chemist. And later he was the mayor of the town of Robbins, Illinois. Her father married Catherine Cordanza, and the couple would have 3 girls together before they divorced after 6 years of marriage. Sam raised his girls on his own until he met Leisha May Parks, who was a single parent as well. So it kind of became a little bit of a Brady Bunch situation. She had kids, he had kids, they had a blended family. So the two of them married, and then they had Nichelle. Grace. She was born Grace Nichelle. So Nichelle was a singer and dancer like right from the start. As soon as she could sing and dance, that is what she was doing. She loved to sing Broadway show tunes. She would put on a show for all of her siblings. She took dance lessons and excelled at ballet. She caught the eye of the world-renowned dancer Katherine Dunham, who after seeing Nichelle dance said her talent was exceptional and to keep in touch. And that was like a really, really big deal. Katherine Dunham dancers were a huge thing. Nichelle's father thought this was a gold star of approval. I mean, Katherine Dunham loves her. So like, you know, it's game on. So he made an appointment for his daughter to audition for the Chicago Ballet Academy. When they arrived at that audition, they were told that they couldn't audition because she was Black and that she was not suited for formal ballet training. Her father insisted that she still auditioned, and he refused to take no for an answer. So Nichelle danced her heart out, and she was granted access to the academy. So it worked. Perseverance and talent worked. In her autobiography, Beyond Uhura, Nichelle wrote, quote, "It never occurred to either of my parents to feel inferior to anybody for any reason. My father taught us, you are not better than anyone else, and there is no one better than you." And this is actually a very common quote that I see when I research successful gals. And it's interesting. There's two interesting things particularly about this quote. Number one, it's immensely powerful. And I always see it as my father used to say. For some odd reason, I don't see it too much as my mom taught us, but I do see it a lot as my father used to say. It's a very encouraging parental philosophy in the 1900s. It's about equality, but it's also about being humble. It's that double dynamic there. Number two, I also see it in African-American stories quite a bit, especially those in this time period of W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the talented 10th. In the book Hidden Figures, it talks very in-depthly about the talented 10th. And it also talks about this mantra of you are not better than anyone else and no one is better than you. The talented 10th by W.E. Du Bois was a theory that there will be a 10th of the population that will inspire the next 10th of the population, and so on and so on. So in that talented 10th, you are a role model. You are a beacon to inspire the next, evolution of greatness. So Nichelle gave it her all at the Chicago Ballet Academy. She was there from age 12 to 14. She also learned Afro-Cuban dance under Carmencita Romano. And it would be Carmencita's connection that would actually get Nichelle a long-time gig at the famous Sherman House, doing a very lavish review show. Nichelle was known as one of the Katherine Dunham dancers. She and three others were performing Katherine's famous choreography, and Katherine herself became super impressed and offered Nichelle a place in her troupe in New York. But her parents said no. She was little. So Nichelle was performing at the Sherman House. It did allow her to meet many famous gals of history. She met, name dropping coming in, Lena Horne, Sarah Vaughan, Peggy Lee, Ella Fitzgerald, and Josephine Baker. Nichelle writes this about Josephine Baker, and I just did my one cool thing for Animal Month was Josephine Baker and her cheetah, so I'm a little obsessed with Josephine Baker. But this is what Nichelle said about meeting Josephine. She said, quote, "I was speechless. In fact, I don't think I uttered a single word. She did all the talking in her high, throaty, sweet French accent. Mother and I floated out of there like a couple of intoxicated butterflies." I think that's exactly how I would too. Josephine Baker was amazing. She was a burlesque performer who also had a pet cheetah named Chiquita, and she would perform and the cheetah would run amok sometimes. It was fun. So when Nichelle's days at the Sherman House came to a close, Nichelle put together a solo act. She got a manager and she changed her name. So she went by Lynn Mayfair for a while, was her stage name. She didn't really like it. She didn't really feel like it was her. So she actually asked her mother to rename her. That's where she went from Grace to Nichelle. So Leisha, her mother, wanted to name her Michelle in the first place. But she liked the idea of the alliteration of the two N's, Nichelle Nichols. I mean, as Gal's Guide, I mean, I get it. You know, having the same letter be is really fun because then her initials were NN. So she went by Nichelle instead of Michelle, which, of course, as I type up any notes, spell check wants to get me every single time. I tell it, no, it's really a name. So when Nichelle was still in her teenage years, she fell head over heels for a dancer named Foster Johnson. He was 15 years older than her, but she didn't care. She dreamed of this world where the two of them were going to be famous dance partners and they would tour the world together. Nichelle's parents, again, were not happy about this idea, and they married in secret in 1951. Nichelle would soon become unhappy as well. With a child on the way, Foster became distant and started to push Nichelle away. Nichelle got offered a job from the famous jazz musician Duke Ellington to choreograph and to perform a new monologue segment during that Duke had composed. Huge deal. Love Duke Ellington. So Nichelle jumped at the chance to be able to do this. Even though she was pregnant, the engagement was 6 weeks and she wasn't showing yet. So she's like, I'm doing this. So Duke also needed 2 male dancers for this segment as well. Nichelle was really hoping this would bring her and Foster closer together. Unfortunately, there was bad blood between Duke Ellington and Foster. There was a lady in the past involved between the two of them, and it got a little ugly. So at the end of the engagement, Foster took a gig in Canada, and the marriage was over. It's kind of dissolved. Nichelle's only child, Kyle Johnson, was born August in 1951, but during his delivery, Nichelle passed out and went into a coma for 3 days. She awoke and her mother was by her side, and Kyle was happy and healthy, which is amazing, but still, girl went into a coma after delivering her child. Now, as a single parent, Nichelle worked really hard to provide for her and her son. She sang at the Blue Angel. She played Carmen in a Chicago run of the play Carmen Jones. She was the opening act for comedians as well, like Red Fox and even the band Lionel Hampton. She also got praise for her performance in a James Baldwin play, Blues for Mr. Charlie. She was nominated twice for a Sarah Sidian Best Actress Award. But life on the road can be rewarding financially and spiritually, being around lots of people in new places, but it's tiresome. Nichelle took a really big chance and decided to move her family to Los Angeles and to focus on film and TV work because it was more steady and you could be in one spot was the idea. She was a dancer in the film Porgy and Bess. She starred in the TV movie Getting Up in the Morning that released in 1964. But it would be called to the set of a certain TV show called The Lieutenant that would align the stars in a very new way for Nichelle. You see, The Lieutenant was created by this up-and-coming writer named Gene Roddenberry, right? So Gene had been a TV writer for nearly a decade, and he was building a name for himself as a show creator. One show he was pitching around Hollywood was called Star Trek. Dun, 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 starting to come together. Now, Gal's Guide actually has 3 podcasts, and we've talked about Gal's Guide, or we've talked about Star Trek actually quite a bit, especially with Uhura's Training Academy, right? But we have even talked about Star Trek in our Your Gal Friday episode when we talked about Lucille Ball. So I love Lucy, Lucille Ball, a very interesting little sidebar connection that I'm going to try to draw these dots or connect these dots here. Lucille Ball owned Desilu Productions with her husband, Desi Arnett. So the Desi and the Lou. There's the Desilu. So they started so they could actually do I Love Lucy as a production, as well as for syndication for I Love Lucy specifically. But when the couple divorced, Lucy and Desi actually divorced, which still kind of blows my mind a little bit. I know it's very silly, but I always think of them together because TV show magic. But Lucy bought the remaining shares of Desilu Productions, and she took control of the studio. This actually made Lucille Ball the first ever woman to head a major television studio. She doesn't usually get credit for that, but she is. Now, the production companies live and die by original programming. By this time that Lucy was taking control of the board, I Love Lucy was in syndication. So they needed original shows. And one project that was pitched to Desilu was a sci-fi show by Gene Roddenberry. Now, Lucy reportedly at first thought that Star Trek was about celebrities doing USO shows to entertain soldiers at military bases around the world. So she thought, this is great. Stars are going trekking. I love this idea. Green light, go ahead, go make it. Well, she eventually learned what the show was, but she loved it. So probably thought the actual Star Trek show was much better than what she thought the Star Trekking was. But CBS, who had to deal with Desilu, wasn't totally on board. They passed on it. So Roddenberry actually pitched the idea to NBC, and they ordered a pilot episode called The Cage. And the budget was really expensive for this high-flying adventure. And of course, now that Lucy knew actually what the show really was, she actually overruled the board of directors to give them enough money to make sure that they had what they needed to get that episode made. When NBC saw The Cage, the pilot episode, they rejected it. And they ordered a recast and a reworking. They were worried it was too cerebral for people to understand it. So basically like dumb it down. Right. So this brought in William Shatner, better for worse. It brought in William Shatner to play Captain Kirk. And the episode was called Where No Man Has Gone Before. And for all of this to happen, Lucy had to once again defy her board and give the project the financial money that it needed to actually get it working. So Star Trek finally aired in 1966. It was the first show to do reruns. It was one of the first shows to do reruns, and it opened the door for Star Trek to create a legacy as well. So let's see. So former studio executive Ed Hawley said, quote, "If it was not for Lucy, there would be no Star Trek today." So very much so, Lucille Ball gets a lot of credit for making sure that Star Trek is in existence. So now Nichelle, let's bring Nichelle into this. So Nichelle's journey onto Star Trek would begin with meeting Gene on the set of The Lieutenant, his other show that he was working on, and it would continue over lunches. They would talk about this idea of the Star Trek show, and it started to take shape in Gene's head. Even though Nichelle writes in her autobiography that she and Gene fell in love, she says, quote, "Certainly our relationship was long over before Star Trek began." So that's what she says. So in fact, Nichelle was touring Europe when her agent insisted that she come to an audition happening in Los Angeles. Grudgingly, she came to Los Angeles. She was reading a treatise on Africa that was called Uhuru, and she was reading that in the waiting room, and she was shocked to see that Gene was among the show's producers that she was auditioning for. Yeah, right? So the character of Uhura had not yet been created at that audition. They just knew they really wanted to see her and possibly cast her for this show. Leonard Nimoy had already been cast as Spock, but they still had Nichelle read Spock's lines to kind of get an idea of her tone and how she would read it, how she would take on a character. And she got a spot on the bridge. basically saying Spock's lines for the audition. So Nichelle and Jean would work on the character of Uhura together. They created a backstory for her, and they gave her the name Uhura, which is Swahili meaning freedom. And it came from the treatise that she was reading that particular day. So Uhura was the first African-American character on television who was not a servant or a maid. It was huge. This was a very big deal in regards to especially little Black girls who were watching that. They saw that the future had a sister on the bridge who is in charge of communications. They came through her, and it was amazing. It was also a big deal to NBC. So they actually wanted Uhura's character cut out, right? Jean refused, absolutely refused. Nichelle didn't find out till way later that there was actually a big campaign and some contractual magic that saved Uhura's character from NBC's cutting knife. So yes. So even though Nichelle had bonded with the rest of the cast, you know, the money was good. The time with her son was wonderful, being in one spot. She wrote in her autobiography, quote, Uhura was a new kind of television woman in many ways. Yet even in this early point of the show, it was becoming uncomfortably obvious that whatever ambitious plans Jean had for my character, Uhura's roles was constantly diminished. So unfortunately, there was like great ideas, but her character kept getting smaller and smaller. Racism from the studio and the network was getting increasingly uncomfortable. The mailroom was told to withhold her mail from her because she was getting more than anybody else. And, you know, some of them have very, very light egos. And if they found out they were not getting the most amount of fan mail, they might have some problems. Not naming any names, I think it's all obvious. But her backstory, Uhura's backstory wasn't being told. Her lines were getting fewer and fewer. The writers and Gene Roddenberry were fighting the good fight, but it was very frustrating to try to get anything through. And Nichelle felt like she was just sitting there when she could be on a Broadway stage somewhere, singing and dancing, her passion, what she had trained for. So she decided to turn in her written resignation to Star Trek. She went to Gene after they had wrapped the last show of season 1, and she told him that she was leaving. He asked her to think about it. The next evening, she was scheduled to appear at an NAACP event. And at that event, she was told that her biggest fan wanted to meet her. And she's like, cool, a Trekker. She always calls them Trekkers, by the way. Trekkie, Trekker, tomato sort of thing. But this biggest fan, she's like, okay, all right, I'm ready for this. Her biggest fan was Martin Luther King Jr. And he approaches her and she's like, I'm supposed to meet my biggest fan. He's like, yes, that's me. I am your biggest fan. He told her that that is the only show that he and Coretta let their daughters watch and stay up late to watch is Star Trek. So Nichelle went, that's cool, I'm leaving. And he's like, no, you can't leave. You have to do the show. He insisted that she stayed on the show. The idea that Uhura's job as a communication officer was not a Black role. In fact, it was not even a female role. The role could be replaced by an alien. So it was important for her to be in that chair. It was important that the bridge was the best of the best, and that one of them was a Black woman was extremely important to the cause of civil rights, and also for shaping the future in the imagination of the American public, of that a woman of color is represented in the future was extremely important. So Nichelle went back to Gene and she asked if she could tear up her resignation letter, and she decided to stay on and stay in that chair as Uhura. So the show would go on for 2 more seasons. In 1968, Nichelle and William Shatner were the first actors to share an on-screen interracial kiss in the episode Plato's Stepchildren. Apparently, the first script, it was Spock and Uhura were supposed to share a kiss, but when Shatner found out it would make television history, suddenly there was a rewrite. So yes, there was worry that there was going to be angry letters that would come into the studio. According to Nichelle's interviews, there was none. There was no angry letters that came in. In the 3rd season of the original series, it seemed pretty clear, at least to Nichelle, that the show was ending. She got offered a role on a TV show, Mannix. Mannix is also a Desilu production, which original programming, and she was ecstatic. This part was actually written for her in mind. It was the part of Peggy Fair, and there was very few roles for Black women on television. So the fact that this was written for her and it was in the same production company, and really she didn't have to move because it was going to be right there, she was super excited about it. However, they wouldn't let her out of her Star Trek contract to be able to cement the deal, even though everybody knew that Star Trek was going to be done. They still wouldn't let her out of it. Gene wouldn't let her out of it, and Nichelle was very, very hurt by this. For a good long time, she was hurt that she couldn't get out of her contract to do another show. So when Star Trek was canceled in 1969 for so many reasons, there's countless books and articles and even internet pages dedicated to theories why it was canceled. Nichelle had newly married near the end of the last season. She married Duke Monday. He was a songwriter, and she was hoping that he would really center her life, but she didn't love him, and so the marriage ended in divorce several years later. It wasn't too long after the cancellation of Star Trek that the very first Star Trek convention started. And Nichelle wrote about this in her autobiography. She said, quote, "I attended that first convention in 1970, and I never plan to stop. The Trek conventions are unlike any other fan gathering, perhaps because a Trekker is unlike any other fan in the world. One would be hard-pressed to find such a large group of intelligent, sensitive, aware people." So yes, I love that. And this is where I gloriously plug Starbase Indy. Starbase Indy is the Star Trek convention that is local to Indianapolis that Gal's Guide attends and does the in-person Uhura's Training Academy. So Starbase Indy is the local fan-run Star Trek convention. Highly recommend it. It's Thanksgiving weekend every year. There, plug, check. But at the same time, Nichelle loves them. So with fans wanting new material, Gene worked with many of the original writers on an animated series. So the idea was to hire William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy to voice Kirk and Spock, but then to have the other voice actors for the rest of the characters, just voice actors to save money. Apparently William Shatner was fine with this, but Leonard Nimoy said he would not do it if the rest of the main cast was not included. So he would not do it. So the crew got back together again. So from 1973 to 1974, Star Trek, the animated series, was on. The show won an Emmy, and Uhura got to command the ship. There's an episode called Laura Lee's, I think it's Laura Lee's Command or something like that, or Laura Lee's Signal, there we go, where she gets to take command of Enterprise. It's very cool. There was also talk at this time about a Star Trek movie, but that would have to wait. Yeah. So the animated series ended, and Nichelle very much wanted to change her image from Uhura. She took on the role of Dorinda in an Isaac Hayes adventure film called Trucker Turner. She worked really hard to make that character different and memorable. She also had a contract with Epic Records. Her album struggled to sell and to return to the stage. She also struggled to return to the stage because it wasn't changing people's perceptions of her. They were still really wanting to see Uhura. That's very much how they wanted to see her, even though she was trying all this different stuff. In 1975, a Star Trek convention in Chicago, Nichelle listened to a presentation by Dr. von Puttkamer about a NASA space program, what it had done, and what it could do. Nichelle noticed one particular thing during this presentation. None of the astronauts looked like her. So she established Women in Motion Incorporated, and through government contracts, she created educational programs and projects for young people using music as a teaching tool. She got to know many of the NASA people firsthand. She even went through real astronaut training. She flew an 8-hour mission aboard the Kepler C-141 and went to the astronomy observation, and she was even there at JPL when the Viking landing touched down on Mars, believe it or not. So in 2015, she flew on the Sophia in a high altitude mission. So girls actually been to lighter versions of space, more space than I've been to. But she has had astronaut training and has been up there in those high altitude missions. After giving a speech at the National Space Institute asking for more women and minorities in the space programs, she started working the problem with John Yardley. He worked at the Office of Manned Spaceflight. He and Dr. Harriet Jenkins of the Equal Opportunity Commission decided that she needed to be a NASA contractor and organize and seek out to find the best minds on the globe and have them report to NASA for astronaut training. Now, she insisted on a particular thing, and I'm going to use her words because they're brilliant and I don't want to mess them up. I love this. But this is what she insisted if she was going to work for NASA to bring more people in, of women and of people of color. She said, quote, "If I put my name and my reputation on the line for NASA and I find qualified men and minority people to apply, and a year from now, I still see a lily white, all-male astronaut corps, I will personally file a class action suit against NASA. I will not be used to attract publicly, and then later hear you say, gee, we really tried, but there weren't any qualified women and minorities out there." That's what she told them. And they agreed. And she got to work. So she had 6 months to find the astronauts of tomorrow. She visited colleges and high schools and technology companies and aerospace corporations and professional organizations. She did TV appearances and newspaper interviews. NASA did not lay the best groundwork for her while she was doing this. Nichelle had to overcome the idea in many people's minds that NASA didn't want women and NASA didn't want minorities. So she had to overcome that. There's going to be a class tomorrow called the Mercury 13, which are the 13 women who actually passed and surpassed some of the Mercury 7 astronauts programs, but were not allowed to become astronauts because they were women. So I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow. That is part of this groundwork that I'm talking about. Yeah, exactly. So there's even a case where for sex discrimination went to the House committee, allowing women and minorities into the space program. That didn't go so well either, that I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. So that also set the tone that NASA wasn't welcoming. So this mindset and brand damage is what Nichelle was up against. She had to counteract that. She had to say they were different, and they had to prove that they were going to be different, that they were going to evolve. So Nichelle's company final report to NASA of her recruitment drive was over 4 pounds of paper. When they started, NASA was receiving about 1,600 applications for this program. Less than 100 were from women, 35 were from minorities. So 4 months in, with Nichelle on the case, there was 8,400 applications. 1,649 of them were from women, and 1,000 of them were from minorities. This is to fill 40 jobs. So over 8,000 applications she generated to fill 40 jobs. Amazing. So of those who applied during this recruitment period were Sally Ride, who was the first American woman in space, Fred Gregory and Guy Bluford, which were the first African-American astronauts, as well as Judith Resnick. Ronna McNair and Ellison Onizuka. There we go, Onizuka. Unfortunately, those last ones perished in the Challenger disaster. Yes. There was also another who was inspired to join NASA because of Nichelle Nichols, Dr. Mae Jemison. So she would become the first African-American woman in space. She says she was inspired by Sally Ride, Martin Luther King Jr., and Uhura from Star Trek. She says that those are her inspirations. She would open each day of her space flight shifts by saying, "Hailing frequencies open," which is Nichelle's, Uhura's common line in the show. Mae Jemison also appeared on an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation and is good friends with Nichelle Nichols in the real lives. So the Women in Motion chapter closed in Nichelle's life, but she stays involved with NASA. And she says that that particular time in her life was, quote, "the most exciting and personally rewarding." There is a documentary about this part of her life. It is called Woman in Motion, the name of her company. And last check, it was making the film festival run. It's very difficult with film festivals right now with the pandemic. A lot of film festivals, though, have moved online. So there is this possibility that online festivals will maybe show it. I have not found it. I did look for it this week to see if there was any online festivals that were showing it. I know that it's still being submitted. It is not on DVD yet. I have not seen it, but if you go to womeninmotionmovie.com, there's a trailer, and it's amazing, showing footage from this time of her NASA recruitment days of what she did and how it meant to her. It's amazing. So the Star Trek future projects had been kind of flip-flopping from feature film to made-for-TV movie from the studio for a while. But two large things happened in 1976 and 1977 that would cement the Star Trek future as we know it. So first of all, the first one was the space shuttle. In the summer of 1976, nearly 500,000 Trekkers wrote letters for the first space shuttle to be rechristened the Constitution to the Enterprise, and it worked. So Gene and the original cast showed up at the space shuttle's public debut. It was thrilling, it was exciting, but the film project was like slowly dragging along. Then suddenly in 1977, there was this little space opera called Star Wars, and suddenly Paramount went, do we have a space adventure opportunity? And they realized, oh yeah, we own the Star Trek series. And so they greenlit the Star Trek, the motion picture. So no matter how you feel about the incredibly long motion picture, it did get the crew back together again, and it did reinvigorate the franchise as a franchise this time. So there were 6 movies with the original cast that were made, and they dominated the 80s, even with very fierce competition. So in 79, there was the Star Trek motion picture. In 82, there was The Wrath of Khan. 84, there was The Search for Spock. 86 was The Voyage Home, 89 was The Final Frontier, and 1991 was The Undiscovered Country. Nichelle's response when she asked what her favorite films are of the Star Trek movies, she says, the even ones. That is her answer. After the films had ended, Nichelle went back to musical theater. She did a one-woman show at the University of California, San Bernardino about Ethel Waters, a Black singing legend. She expanded the show into a 2-act musical and had musical numbers showcasing gals from the roaring 20s to the 1990s. I would love to see this. She also took time to host 13 episodes of the Sci-Fi Channel show Inside Space. That's where she met Dr. Mae Jemison face to face. So both gals met in their hometown of Chicago, and the crowds just couldn't get enough of the two of them. It was adorable. Gene Roddenberry's health, unfortunately, had been failing for some time, and he passed away in 1991 at the age of 70. Nichelle calls him, quote, the great bird of the galaxy. She co-wrote a song about Gene and sang it at his funeral. The two had a complicated relationship, but one thing was very clear. They always admired each other's tenacity. That's what always brought them back together and had a common thread, is they loved each other's tenacity. So with Gene's passing, it seemed that there was a lot of reflecting that started to happen, and the cast was very eager to write their side of the Star Trek legacy. So DeForest Kelley, Bones, was the only one of the original 7 not to publish an autobiography in the 90s. Even though Leonard Nimoy was actually the first one to write his autobiography in 75, this wave in the 90s would see William Shatner publish the first of many autobiographies, Star Trek Memories. That included interviews with the cast members, most notably missing Jimmy Doohan, who refused to talk to him. Nichelle doesn't have the kindest words for Bill's autobiography in her book. She was quite hurt by his actions, but seems to have forgiven him, or at least kind of come to terms in the later years. I mean, relationships are complicated. So when it came to the big crossover movie of Star Trek Generations, where it's the original cast and Next Generation in the same movie, George Takei, and Nichelle were not invited. Whoopi Goldberg was pissed when she found out. Whoopi was deeply inspired by Nichelle, as well as her character of Uhura, and was looking forward to the opportunity of having those two Star Trek characters in one place. She said it was a major missed opportunity, and I think she was putting it very nicely. Nichelle had been spending her time since the Star Trek films doing a good number of voice acting, including Batman the Animated Series, Gargoyles, Spider-Man 1997, Buzz Lightyear of Star Command, and Futurama. She returned to TV to play Nana Dawson on the 2007 show Heroes, and she was a guest performer on the soap opera The Young and the Restless, where she was nominated for a Daytime Emmy. Nice. When it comes to her other notable awards and accolades, in 1982, Robert A. Heinlein dedicated his novel, Friday, to Nichelle. Nichelle has an asteroid named after her. For those of you who likes trivia and that sort of thing, her asteroid is called 68410 Nichols. There you go. So Nichols and lots of numbers. That is what her asteroid is called. In 1991, she and the cast of Star Trek were immortalized in handprints in Mann's Chinese Theater. In 1992, she got her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And in 2016, she received a Life Career Award from the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films. So, yes. In 2015, a few months after Leonard Nimoy passed away, Nichelle had suffered a minor stroke, but recovered. Her son, Kyle, announced that Nichelle is currently struggling with dementia. However, she is 88 years old, and hailing frequencies are open. And there was going to be, I think actually, now I'm trying to remember if it was June or July, there was going to be a farewell presentation, like a retirement, you know what I mean? All the wonderful things we want to say about Nichelle and how she has influenced us. And I will actually have to research that and send you the information of when and if it is. I know it was coming. And then with the COVID, I don't know what happened to it, if it has been postponed or if it has been canceled. But she is having a retirement party. No, when it comes to her legacy, in Nichelle's book, Beyond Uhura, she says this. She says, quote, "Every time I sat down at my council on the bridge of the Enterprise, I felt I was in the 23rd century, that I was Uhura. The promise of that imaginary universe was real to me, and I'm still very proud of Uhura, proud of who she was or will be and what she represented, not only in her time, but in ours and those people who will discover Star Trek decades from now. As we inch closer to that Star Trek universe we revere from afar, I've often thought about what my paternal grandparents would say if they saw me there. And I know despite all of the technical jargon and the space age trappings, they would understand. After all, they too boldly went where no one had gone before, by shaping their little piece of the world to conform to their vision of what was right. By doing so, they made the world we live in today a better place than the one that they were born into. And I thought that was lovely. So Nichelle's legacy is keeping open those hailing frequencies. She inspired Dr. Mae Jemison to be an astronaut. She inspired Whoopi Goldberg to be an actress and be on television. These are just two of the gals that she inspired to go and follow their dreams. And there are countless, countless more. Because she changed the landscape for writers and producers, they now saw how diverse it would be to tell a richer story, how it would inspire audiences around the world. So when Nichelle looked around NASA history of high-profile astronauts and commanders and did not see Jean's vision for the future, a vision that she really believed in and she worked hard for, she used her celebrity, she used her resources, she gave NASA the second chance that it really, really needed. And because of Nichelle, we got Sally Ride and Fred Gregory and Guy Bluford and Judith Resnick and Ronald McNair and Elzan Uskan, and they were made our role models and heroes, and it made the world a more colorful place. So what I personally take away from Nichelle's story is that sometimes life has other plans for you. She really wanted to be a dancer and a singer. That is what her life's ambition was. Uhura was not a role that showed off the skills that she had been working on since she was 12. Granted, yes, it showed off her legs, which are fabulous, but not so much in a musical theater sort of way. So there are times that she resisted, and then there are times she persisted when she saw that that character, a Black character, who was the starting point of a vision of the future. So she opened those communications up, and it's really up to us to keep telling that story, to keep telling her story, and to keep those communications open. So yeah, so that is the life and legacy of Nichelle Nichols. So I will open it up for questions, and I will pose these questions. You don't have to answer these, you can answer any. But what did you personally learn from Nichelle's story?